we've
and
met
I think
the
Catherine's that
panelists
area.
already today, but I just want to introduce the moderator, Sylvia Nickerson, who also wrote the bios earlier today. So Sylvia Nickerson is an educator in the history of science and mathematics for the Institute of History and Philosophy of Science and Technology at the University of Toronto and the Department of Mathematics at McMaster University. She served recently as content editor for the Canadian Society for the History and Philosophy of Mathematics Bulletin. Last year, her student Shane Wang was awarded second place in the undergraduate student paper contest of the History of Mathematics Special Interest Group of the Mathematical Association of America. So, Sylvia.
Thanks. Okay, I think we can just leave that there. Okay. Okay, so thanks everyone, and thanks to Jenna for handling the panel and the speakers, and thanks to the speakers and their work, and to the audience for taking an interest today in history. I also want to thank the leadership team at Fields for their support and all this work organizing the conference. Okay, so we have an opportunity to further investigate with our speakers Fields' life and legacy, as well as discuss the significance of some of the artifacts you see displayed here related to Fields' life and work and the 1924 International Congress of Mathematicians and the founding of the Fields Medal. So just before we get into a discussion, I just thought, now many of you have already looked at what's here, but you might be wondering what some of these things on the display consist of. So I just thought I'd just go over a couple of things related to the objects. So we have a couple of items related to the production of Fields' monograph, Theory of Algebraic Functions of a Complex Variable, published in Berlin by Mayer and Mueller in 1906. So we have the handwritten manuscript Fields prepared for this text, likely what was sent to the printer for typesetting. And I believe that happened in Sweden with Matthias Leffler's assistance. We also have a text that appears to be page proofs Fields may have, or no, it's a proof copy or an off print, right, of a journal a journal article he printed. So thanks to Marcus for bringing those items today. We also have copies of the proceedings of the 1924 International Congress of Mathematicians. Sorry, my slides seem to be on a timer, so I apologize for that. These are presented on book display furniture from the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. I just also wanted to thank them. This copy of the proceedings belongs to the Fields Institute and bears an inscription from Fields to Jessie Dunlop. Jessie, made a widow after the death of her husband, David Alexander Dunlap, a lawyer and mining entrepreneur, financed the building of the David Dunlap Observatory for the Department of Astronomy at the University of Toronto. And so maybe also there's a trail in that signature around Fields' efforts to fundraise. Fields worked with the University of Toronto Press for 4 years to composite and print this large publication. Publishing this book was as much about capacity building, conferring status and demarcating group membership, as I think it was about the communication of information. We talked earlier about Fields' burial monument in Hamilton, and there was this interesting suggestion that the monument be made bigger. But I think this is Fields' monument made of paper. Fields had to help train and oversee the compositors at the University of Toronto Press in setting all of this in movable type. It's almost 2,000 pages. This was a tedious process that required special skills to be developed in the press's compositors. And investing in building that capacity to print mathematical texts locally paved the way for others to print locally authored mathematical works here. So before, I think it was common before that for stereotype plates to be shipped over here, principally from England, for Canadian editions to appear of texts that were originally composed and authored elsewhere, typically Britain. Printed in folio, this is not a small quarto or octavo book, right? It's embossed on the cover with the coat of arms of Canada, which was new in 1921. So if you think now, you know, often in the parlance of our daily lives, we have a sense of what is a luxury item. But if you think back to the quality of books, there was also would have been an immediate sense upon the viewer of this book that this was something of importance. The way these were produced, even the cost of the paper and the size of the margins would have spoken to someone kind of conversant in print culture at the time about status and exclusivity. So even to an audience who may not have comprehended the contents, the package in which they were delivered from a material object perspective embodied the professionalism fields wish to see mathematicians recognized for in Canada, but also locally and globally. And so if you haven't, this is just where the University of Toronto Press probably would have worked on it at the Wycliffe College building, which is near Hart House, which was previously discussed. And just in case you don't have time or ability to flip through the volumes, here are some other things in the volumes, just the frontispieces from both volumes. So we might discuss in the panel a little bit about the complement of papers from different subject areas that were delivered at the 1924 ICM. Sections 1 and 2, primarily in areas of pure mathematics, comprise the most. Right, in terms of geographical area where people came from, it was largely a North American delegated conference, although people did come from all over the world. And some people send in corresponding papers. And these are just some sample pages throughout the book, just to give you a bit of a flavor of it. Okay. And I found this many years ago in the University of Toronto Press records. So in 1936, the book was selling for $10 in an advertisement to Ontario teachers among a list of other mathematics and physics textbooks that ranged from about 50 cents to $2.50. So I'm not sure who is buying the proceedings. I think somewhere in Elaine's book, you mentioned that Fields had written a letter where he said he'd gotten rid of or unloaded about 700 copies. This was in the early, yeah, well, it's in your book. I remember refreshing my memory about that. And this is appears in the volume. It's a map of the Western excursion that participants in the Congress took, along with some of the participants in the concurrent British Association for Advancement of Science meeting, which ran at the same time as the 1924 ICM. And the photograph outside, I'm not sure, Kristen, if we've like attached the pages, but it's really quite large. Some of the original photograph from the archive's been truncated. And if you're interested in finding any kind of celebrity participants, their names would be in the proceedings itself. Okay, so I'll just stop that. So let's just begin now. So I was gonna ask Marcus your first question, although anybody can step in, and of course we can take questions from the audience as well. So your talk implies Fields' education was very important to his formation as a mathematician. Can you speak to what mathematical culture, such as books, textbooks, journals, teachers, research Fields would have had access to at University of Toronto as an undergraduate student, and how that contrasted with what he learned elsewhere? Do you know if it was unusual for graduates of the math department at U of T in 1884 when Fields graduated to pursue doctoral or postdoctoral studies at the time?
Yeah, so I haven't had an opportunity to look at who else would have graduated and pursued postdoctoral, doctoral studies, majoring in mathematics, but I think just from a numbers perspective, it would have been fairly unusual. So I can say that. In terms of the math, we saw in my talk, some of the topics that he would have learned as an undergrad, just as a core curriculum, and you can see it was relatively basic. And even the more advanced stuff was, first or second year mathematics that we might teach today as well. So I think it was very like basic and a little bit more pragmatic, which I think also reflected the nature of the majority of the graduates, right? They would have been going into industry, into jobs in Canada, administration, things like that. So there wasn't really a need or there wasn't really value seen to train people to do postgraduate work, right? So it contrasted greatly with what he saw at Johns Hopkins and also what he saw in Europe. In particular, he was really fond of the German system where research and professors would be doing pure research and students would attend their lectures and they would hear lectures about groundbreaking research, just like we are today. At this event, right? We're hearing from people who are doing state of the art. They're talking about conjectures, so he really felt that was valuable. And so, yeah, so I think there was a great contrast. And when he came back to Canada in his writings to like various like non-mathematical writings, he would often emphasize that aspect that it's important for its own pursuit, but it also had important implications for society and for the improvement of society as well.
Mhm. Okay, we could maybe return to that. I might have a follow-up question about that in terms of U of T often kind of modeled after the English university, and I know Fields wrote a lot about his admiration for the German university model. So there's a contrast there that could be explored for sure. But anyway, keeping in mind our interest of time, Elaine, both your talk and Marcus's talk mentioned Fields' upbringing and education. Raised on the outskirts of British Empire, Fields ended up in spaces where he participated in advanced seminars at Johns Hopkins and learned about like Georg Cantor's set theory and Max Planck's theoretical physics, among other fairly cutting edge research during his 5 years of self-funded postdoctoral study. His facility in languages, he was fluent in German, French, and knew some Spanish, is also known. So did all this investment in himself that he did in training abroad lead to his maintenance of a certain international outlook in his activities when he came back to Toronto and his commitment to pursuing that?
I think his own experiences in Germany and France and in the States must have given him a tremendously international outlook, and his ability with languages also helped him to meet people. So I think he felt quite confident moving in international circles. And I don't think about it as investing in himself, but of course that's what he did. He took his family money and spent it on his further education.
Yeah, well, he was a resource that in some ways, he could then share, right, with his students or, with the contacts back at the University of Toronto, perhaps when he landed back here as a professor.
He was not considered to have been a good teacher.
That's
I
true.
read an article about him which was quite critical of his teaching. It said he filled up one blackboard with a chalk in one hand and a sponge in the other, and then he moved on and then went back to the first blackboard and with his sponge and his chalk. So I can't say he was a good teacher. He was apparently very hospitable with people if students came after school and after his classes and wanted further information. He was very helpful.
Right.
But I don't think he can be considered to have been a good lecturer.
Were there ways he might have shared that like international outlook or experiences he would have had internationally when he was directly president of the Royal Canadian Institute in that work?
Well, he wrote about attending the Oval centenary in 1902. That was his first international conference that he attended. He was very impressed by that, and he attended the 1912 Congress in Cambridge because he was on the organizing committee. He did not attend in 1920. So the only Congress that we know for sure that he attended was the 1912 in Cambridge. He had an international outlook born of his own experience and love of travel.
Great. Okay. Let's talk about money for a minute, Dimitry.
Why me?
Also, we were talking during the break about that, about the money and the relative value of money. Now, we haven't necessarily locked down the relative value of money, but I seem to recall from my recent readings of things that an annual professor's salary around that time would have been $100. Now, I'm not sure if I remember that. No, annual salary would have been $100. So if I'm right about that, then the contributions to the ICM that Dimitry talked about would have been about 5 times the annual salary a professor would earn. And then you were talking about the cost of cars, right, in the 20s. Do you want to just talk about that in terms of relative value of things?
Automobility is something we can all relate to since we all deal with it. But a Model T in 1924 would have cost probably around $400. $400, $450. And these so they're giving it the equivalent of a car. And I can't remember who said at the back, $500 was like 9,000 in equivalent today dollars. So these are not small gifts. They're not huge gifts that are being given. Obviously, the government providing 27,000 or whatever, the Carnegie Foundation, the university providing 2,000. Those are pretty significant donations. $100 and $500 would have been, probably a good outlay for people like this, but it wouldn't have been a huge outlay for people like this. It's all relative, I suppose, in the 1920s. These are people who are giving lots of money to lots of different things and are being asked for lots of contributions all the time, I suspect.
Right. Okay. So Elaine characterizes Fields in her book as someone, and in the talk too, searching for a Canadian benefactor along the lines of John Hopkins, who established in 1976 the university in his name, Fields attended, with a $7 million bequest.
Yeah.
Or an Andrew Carnegie, who bequeathed $350 million in his lifetime towards charities, foundations, and universities, right? So in 1918, Fields gave an address at the Toronto Board of Trade in which he highlighted the $500,000 Andrew and Richard Mellon gave to found the Mellon Institute of Industrial Research in 1913. Clearly, he was looking south, right, for his examples. Was Toronto in the early 20th century just lacking philanthropists with this level of cash? Or do you think other cultural or nationalistic reasons explain why Fields was not successful through his work with the Canadian Institute, for example, in finding greater financial support for research, for science, for math?
Well, I don't think Canada did not at that time have a philanthropic tradition. In the States they did. Canada did not. And at that time, in the early 20th century, the universities were springing up across the country, and they were all looking for money. So it isn't as if you had all of Canada to draw from, because the various universities were all looking for money. And they weren't the only charities, of course. So I think Fields did pretty well. And he valued the $100 and the $50 and the $75 and the $500. He valued wherever he could find a contributor, he was appreciative. So there was no Canadian tradition of research. So he was also looking for money for areas that had not been stressed in Canada at all.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, because there is some charitable giving that's going on in Canada. So the Masseys, for instance, created the Massey Family Foundation in the early 1900s, and they have a pretty amazing record of giving money away. Hart Massey builds the Massey Hall for $1.2 million in 1892. It's one of the greatest concert halls in all of North America. So, and obviously, as I mentioned in my talk, Hart House is built. Lillian Massey's building, the Household Science Building, is on the corner of Avenue Road and Bloor. It's no longer owned by the university, but that's another fantastic building. And eventually, the Massey Foundation builds Massey College, and still to this day endows the Massey Lectures and various other aspects. So there is a tradition of philanthropy. It's just not as prominent as the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and the Fords. Who everybody's getting money from. Our bookstore, just right beside us here, is a Carnegie library. It's one of the Carnegie libraries. There's 6 Carnegie libraries that are built in Toronto. That's the main branch. That becomes our bookstore. And Canadians are getting the benefit of that. But there are other Canadians who are giving money to philanthropic, but also academic endeavors. And Canadians are so, unfortunately, we don't recognize our history as much as we should. So there's a guy by the name of Donald Smith, Lord Strathcona, who at one point is the owner of the Hudson's Bay, largest single shareholder in the Hudson's Bay Company, the Bank of Canada, one of the largest shareholders of the Canadian Pacific Railway, and one of the largest shareholders of the Iranian British Petroleum Company. He dies in 1915, and he gives most of his money to McGill. So much of McGill, much of the structures of McGill, the Royal Montreal Hospital, all that stuff is there. So we don't get that money. And partly it's a consequence of the fact that Toronto is behind Montreal. We don't have as much wealth quite yet. Our wealth really starts to kick in after 1945 in terms of really successful endeavors and enterprises. Much of that money is in Montreal, and a lot of it stays in Montreal.
Yes, Fields went to Montreal and Quebec City
Yeah.
to try to raise money, and he found that the loyalty to McGill and was such that he couldn't crack
He couldn't break into
Montreal.
that network.
Mount Allison was also raising money at the time, and so people in Nova Scotia
Yeah.
and the Maritimes gave to Mount
Yeah.
Allison. There were a lot of competitors for
Yes,
money.
yes.
at
So
that
the one
time.
other point that I'll raise, and I just asked Elaine this, what was Fields' religious denomination? He's a Methodist. So the Methodist Mafia, which there's a number of the people that I mentioned in my talk are part of this Methodist persuasion, Methodist view, and they give their money to churches. So there's an awful lot of beautiful churches in the city of Toronto, which is where a lot of this money is going to, because at the time, even in the 1920s, religion is so significant. And, as the Methodists, they're very modest and they want to give back to the church in any way they can. So that's where some of the money goes too. But, Torontonians are giving money. They're giving money to the Sick Kids Hospital. They're giving money to all kinds of places. They're giving money to the university, but it doesn't show up in the same way. And he never finds a sugar daddy who's really interested in math.
No, he needed to find someone who
Yeah.
who saw his
Yes.
vision of math
Yeah.
and its importance. He tried.
And he couldn't.
He knocked on all doors.
And you got to get lucky. So here at the university, we have the Schwartz-Riehm Institute for, what's it called again? AI, basically. Artificial intelligence. And that's Jerry Schwartz and Heather Riehm. They gave $100 million because that's what they're interested in. And we got lucky on that because none of them went to U of T. None of the kids went to U of T. And he was always looking for somebody like that. And he just couldn't find that person, I don't think.
He didn't find it. He didn't find a benefactor. He looked.
Yeah. Give him
Tried.
credit for trying.
I do.
There's
Yeah,
a question
there-
at the back. So.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, was that? All right.
Some administrator claimed that they didn't think the U of T should be a research institution.
I couldn't hear.
One of you quoted an administrator saying that they didn't think U of T should be a research institution. I remember that the physicist Rutherford was at McGill early in the 20th century, and I was wondering if this is again a Toronto-Montreal split, if Montreal was ahead of the game in believing in research.
So the administrator who said that U of T shouldn't have graduate studies.
Oh, yes, there was a premier of Ontario who
Yeah.
did not want University of Toronto turned into a graduate school. He
Yeah.
said our university. He was proud of the university, but he was thinking at the undergraduate level.
Yeah, and there's probably something to that McGill U of T split. McGill's older. At the time, they have more status than U of T. U of T is on the make. And it's after the 1920s, and especially after the 1940s, that U of T really kind of comes into its own and is able to compete at that level and becomes a U15 university. I mean, U of T becomes a U15, I think in the 20s. I think it joins in the 20s.
Becomes a which?
A U15. So there's only 2 Canadian universities amongst the top 15 research universities, McGill and U of T. So we join the Ivies and everybody else, but I don't think that happens until the 20s. But I think there's something to be said about that break between McGill and U of T and where that status is. And, one of the key things is the University of Toronto is the provincial university, right? It becomes a non-secular institution. It's really seen, not necessarily as a teaching university, but it's seen as the provincial university where it's got practical applications to it. And research only becomes really, really important a little bit later on, I'd say. And, not in math, certainly not until, that's when it starts to really get going in the 20s.
Fields did say that the First World War, if it did nothing else, brought home to the realization that the power of math. He wrote that.
Yeah, the war might have changed.
I don't know if I have it quite right, but this question of a university president having difficulty changing the university or adding a graduate school to a university. I think that was a factor in Princeton University about the same time. And the president of Princeton at that time, or a few years earlier, was Woodrow Wilson. Now, my understanding is that it was he that wanted, among members of the faculty, I think he wanted a graduate school. Now, it wasn't the government so much, but maybe more the alumni of Princeton University who did not want a graduate school. And apparently it was a really nasty fight. And when he tried to run for president of the United States, people wondered if he, as a university president, you know, whether he would be tough enough to handle all of the cut and thrust of US presidential politics. And he said, that's nothing compared to the politics of being a university president.
I have heard it said that the reason that university politics are so difficult is because the stakes are so low.
I want to say something. I mean, first of all, it's a side remark. I checked the salaries in Ontario around 29, 21, and they were like, in Ontario, it was more than 1,600 a year. So this 100 probably was monthly salary, not annual salary. But I'm not talking about that. I'm saying that probably graduate school was so small everywhere in the world before the Second World War. And money started to pour in science only after Second World War because of the nuclear projects. And actually, that's how government started to really raise salaries. And it goes everywhere, in Soviet Union, in America, everywhere. So this is phenomenon of 50s and 60s, when they started to produce, maybe overproduce PhD and researchers and stuff like that. Then, of course, now funding goes a little bit down from the time of 60s. But unfortunately, the funny thing is because of nuclear bomb, that money started to go everywhere in science and research. I'm under this impression. Is it correct?
When did the Institute for Advanced Studies begin?
30s. It started in 30s, but it's a very small institution.
In the 30s.
It's a tiny institution.
Yeah.
Even now, it's a tiny institution.
Yeah.
Well, I believe after this First World War, Fields had a few successes. Like he did successfully lobby the Ontario legislature for an annual grant of $75,000 for scientific research for the university. So there's some success, and also an act of parliament in 1917 establishes the National Research Council. So in that post First World War period, there might have been some change of opinion around the role of investing in science, right?
By the state,
Yeah.
though, not private entities, right?
That's true.
Like, this
By
is
the
the thing.
state.
He's got to go to
Yeah.
the government.
Yeah.
Because he can't get anybody who's going to give him money like a Carnegie or a Rockefeller.
That was Fields's belief that the
Yeah.
government could replace the philanthropists that
Yeah.
Canada lacked.
My feeling is that Fields was a little bit ahead of time, but his second success in Flames, he also influenced for good the future. This is my feeling. This is also clear from the Fields medal. I mean, he was definitely successful in one way or another. Yeah. So there's there was also, when we were speaking about this Princeton and so in 30s, this become even before this nuclear UII, of course, about what happened after Second World War. But even before this, in Institute of Advanced Study was founded before, and that was a wonderful thing. But there was some good luck was necessary. That when Abraham Flexner was writing this article, then somebody noticed this article, and they promoted his idea of education, and it got the funds. But the things like activities like Fields and Abraham Flexner and others are very necessary.
Yeah. I'll just say one thing, because so you can see some motivation factors for the creation of the Fields Medal. So when he was trying to fundraise, right, he didn't get the sugar daddy for mathematics, right? And so the Nobel Prizes were created around, around the same time, but of course there wasn't one in mathematics. And so I think there's an indication that Fields felt that the fact that there wasn't an international award in mathematics was sort of it was demoted mathematics. It wasn't the queen of the sciences, right? It was it was just, something done on the blackboard. So I think part of it also was he was trying to elevate the profession and saying, it is worthy of a medal. There's amazing work being done, and it should be recognized on an international level. So, he brought that international perspective, but it, at the same time, it probably would have helped Canada as well, because, again, so I think there's an argument that could be made there. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, he had a little money, but never enough. Never enough.
Okay, well, coming back again to that topic of money, so I'm going to come back to that. So in terms of the profile of the business elite in Toronto in 1924, so we saw they were engaged in developing industries around alcohol production, transportation, agriculture, all these food, production, power generation, all these different things. So when we look at the nature of the research brought to Canada for the 1924 ICM, 103 papers were contributed having to do with pure mathematics. If you look at sections 1 and 2 combined, and the next most popular area was physics, with 51 papers, followed by applied math with 47. So there were 6 sections, so those were the top 3. So while Fields was determined to obtain more funding for what seemed like a high value placed on pure research, applied knowledge had a strong presence at the 1924 meeting. And a lot of the delegates were from North America too. So can you comment on the kinds of values Toronto's elite might have had with respect to knowledge, and what was the most important type for advancing their interests at the time?
I don't know anything about the Toronto elites from the 1920s, except that the Masseys, of course, contributed hugely to the city. The rest, I don't know anything about them. And Fields knocked on their doors, and some gave and some didn't.
Yeah, I mean, this is an elite that's religious. It's pretty provincial in a way. The city is still the second city, and on the North American Eastern Seaboard, it's like the 3rd, 4th, or 5th city in lots of ways. They have a kind of value system that's based much more on frugal, thrift kind of values that are much more practical. So, I'm not saying that a lot of these contributors didn't see the value in pure or even applied sciences, but, I think that's probably a world away from them and their immediate kind of concerns about how this is going to advance. I think they would have probably said, yeah, this is great. It sounds great. JC, sounds great. You're pitching me some good stuff here, but I don't know how it helps tractor making in Toronto. I don't know how it helps pork slaughtering in Toronto. Maybe that there's a little bit of a distance there between what he's pitching and what they see as their immediate needs. Now, I'm just speculating there because, at the end of the day, there is a lot of contributions, but it goes back to that point about finding somebody who really gets his vision to say, hey, here's a lot of money. And, Carnegie, for all of the fawning fame that he gets, he just builds libraries primarily. I mean, he ends up building 1,000 libraries and filling them with books, which is a pretty practical application of where his money's going. It's not necessarily high level research. And I think, in Toronto, that business elite, probably their vision hasn't quite gotten to that point yet. Maybe, I mean, the Masseys are doing stuff where they're building buildings and providing the infrastructure. But I think it's, Toronto's maybe not quite there yet. The people in Toronto are not quite there to really understand the practical utility of doing a pure research. They want to just build a university that's going to be able to compete with McGill or other universities. So they're not quite there, I think. Maybe that explains it. But yet again, I mean, looking at the biographies of these people, they're pretty practical individuals who are dealing with really real world industries, like you mentioned, retailing, food processing, distilling, stuff like that. So I don't know how much they would see in the kind of things that he was pitching them. What do you think, Elaine?
Well, I can't put myself in the position of those elites in Toronto of the day, but I think that the culture of mathematics was not very developed, not very widely developed, and I don't know what the impact of high school mathematics, for example, was. People went to high school who didn't go to university, so I don't know what the reputation math had among the general public. I have no idea.
I mean, we get the sense just from listening to all the papers and knowing Fields, it's embryonic for him. I mean, this is an embryonic area of study in terms of where it is in Toronto. Obviously, it's grown and developed, and he's trying to make it much more so. And it's just hard for him to accomplish that despite all of his efforts. And he certainly makes amazing efforts. I
Oh,
mean,
he tried very hard.
he really did. And,
Mhm.
you know, between the ICM, between all of his networking, his international outreach, creating the medal, I mean, this guy is really giving it his all.
The medal was his private money. He did not seek for funding for the medal. I don't
Okay,
think.
sure, go ahead, let's hear your question.
I just wonder if you know how Fields was trying to sell math, because he was a contemporary of Hardy. And Hardy is famous for saying math is useless. You pursue it because it's pure. So was Fields trying to sell it as a pure discipline, or was he trying to justify it as having some kind of value?
So I think he saw my sense is that he saw the value, the pure value, but he did presentations like at the student clubs, like the Royal Canadian Institute, and there was talks. I think the proceedings, the contents are actually reflect like a lot of the different talks that were given to like the math and physics club. So there were the pure stuff, but there was this sense of applications or geography, geology. So as this conversation was going on, I was also thinking, well, what would be interesting is to compare the topics of the proceedings here with the British meeting he was at in 1914, because again, Australia is a Commonwealth country, sort of trying to grow itself as well, and I think that the topics would probably be very similar. So a lot of geology, so a little bit more practical stuff, and so the people, I think, sort of what Dimitry was hitting on is that there's just a lot of growth, so you didn't really have that infrastructure in place where you had the leisure to be able to think about higher order things. And if you think about, okay, Europe, it's been built up for years and years. There's institutions have been around for a long time. You have great libraries, so that there was more space for that, I think. And as a result, probably more value. So like Hardy could get away with saying that because, where he was, whereas if he said that in North America, he might find himself tutoring high school kids.
Well, certainly the 1924 ICM included a talk about the Aurora Borealis. He expanded the boundaries and included a lot of applied math. And some of the talks from the ICM were put on radio, and that was a first, really a first.
Yeah, I think I looked at some of the previous ICMs. I think there were less sections. For this one, there was six sections. So I think they may have expanded, but I didn't, I didn't do a formal
No.
analysis, but it did seem that way. Okay, I want to talk about politics now. So in Otto Lito's book, which both of you, Marcus and Elaine, both of you mentioned, Mathematics Without Borders, A History of the International Mathematical Union. This book elaborates on the political divisions in the mathematical community during the interwar years. After the founding of the International Research Council in 1919, the executive established the International Mathematical Union, creating statutes that excluded the central powers of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey from sending delegates to international meetings, which you mentioned. So this situation meant two ICMs were impacted by this exclusionary decree, the 1921 in Strasbourg and the 1924 one in Toronto. So when Fields attended the first Congress post-exclusion in Bologna in 1928, you mentioned in your book, he was met with friendly respect for his work organizing the 1924 meeting, but simultaneously met with an attitude that the meeting had maybe been illegitimate or somehow, right, not a full meeting. And you mentioned that this was because at that time, the proceedings had been numbered: Zurich 1, Paris 2, Heidelberg 3, Rome 4, Cambridge 5, and then 6, Bologna, which I guess was later corrected. So Elaine, can you speculate any connection between, that you do in your book, between the fact that, we can't know how he felt about that, but that he comes home from Bologna and commences his activities organizing an international mathematical medal? Was there any motive there that would have spurred him, or do you think it was completely an independent continuation of his,
Well,
other
medals
activities.
were popular. He
Mhm.
liked medals. He had won several himself as an undergraduate and as a high school student. And he knew that Mittag Leffler had considered establishing a medal. Mittag Leffler was independently wealthy and, but didn't get round to it because of, for whatever reason. So medals were in the air. And I just think that Fields had money and he did not know what to do with it. He certainly was internationalist in his outlook. And perhaps he thought if he could swing a conference in Toronto, he could swing a medal. But then he died before it was established.
Okay, and then, well, thank you. And then Marcus Fields, as Elaine just mentioned, did die in 1932 at the age of 69 after suffering from ill health for a number of years, which reputedly was brought on by a lot of the strenuous efforts actually of hosting the 1924 meeting. So one of the well-known stipulations for awarding the Fields Medal is that it be given to someone under the age of 40. Now, apparently this age cutoff wasn't explicitly stated by Fields, although he intended it to be an award signaling mid-career recognition, is what I understand. Fields himself was at mid-career at age 40 in 1903. These were productive years for him when he was working on his monograph and just taking up his position at University of Toronto. Do you think there was something about the trajectory of Fields' own life and career that might have made him suggest that this award be best given as a mid-career incentive to further research, not only as an award to research done?
I know he expected it to be awarded to encourage further research. He said nothing about the age of 40. That was a later decision by probably the IMU. But he wanted it not, he did not want it to be an end of career award for work you've accomplished. He wanted it to encourage mathematics.
Yeah, and as Elaine just pointed out, like Fields got medals as a high school student, and I think that was so it really helped propel him forward. So and then you combine that with the lack of recognition of mathematics as sort of worthy of or at the same level of other sciences, even the same practicality. So I think. And if you look at like what happened to him, he was able to, after his parents died, fund his education, go down to Johns Hopkins, and as a result, do the postdoctoral studies. And so I think there's also that sense that encouragement or additional money for young researchers could help them expand and learn. So I think it is related, and in the fact that. Like here, after the university, he was sort of on his own. There was no real support of him. There was, he had to sort of go his own. So I think that emphasis on early career or mid-career to encourage further research was to really help people just to continue to, push their research agenda. So if you look at his own approach, so even though ultimately it never maybe ultimately led to other things. I'm sure it was a lot of work, and I'm sure he could have used some encouragement. So we can speculate that maybe maybe getting a medal mid-career might have helped him just continue that momentum up. So I mean, it's all speculation, but I think you can see some things in his life that might indicate that why he made that stipulation.
Well, in my experience in the culture of mathematics, mathematicians have never understood why Nobel did not create an award for mathematics. And I think that was a sore point for generations.
The rumor.
What?
Cover is false.
Yes. I know
It
the
is false. I'm going to tell it anyway, if you don't mind.
I know one rumor.
Yes, one of the pictures that was shown was of Mittag Leffler.
Yes.
And he looked quite rakish in the picture.
He
And
was
that's
an impresario in every field of
the
life.
rumor is, or so let's say the story is that Nobel inquired, should he give him a prize in mathematics? If he did, who might win it? And they said Mittag Leffler, who was apparently, the story goes, and probably falsely, was having an affair with Nobel's wife.
Wow.
I did look into one or two things in that area, and certainly Nobel. Let me just make sure I've got this straight. Well, Mitag Leffler was married, and he married a Finnish woman with considerable wealth and was able to establish a research institute, although it wasn't known at that time as a research institute. Nobel apparently had a little seamstress in Paris that he was fond of. And I came across that somewhere, but I never found any direct connection between Mitag Leffler and Nobel. They were both probably eminent Swedes who might have been a bit Norwegians. No, Mitag Leffler is Swedish.
They're Scandinavians, okay. You know?
Anyway, I think they were rivals.
On the historical question of when and why the age 40 limit was introduced, I wonder if Hiraku has any insight on this.
Is anybody here a Fields medalist?
Who is?
They're not in the room.
Anybody in the room? So guys, you know, Nobel didn't give one for math. He didn't give one for history either. And the historians are pretty pissed off about it too. Okay? They have one for literature, but a historian has never won it. Just to
And the
show you.
economics only came later.
Yeah, and the economics one's a fake too. Sorry, it's not a fake. Yeah. Oh,
Where you get your vocabulary.
yeah, sorry.
It seems to be free form for us to ask questions. I have a different thing. I talk to my students a lot about the language in which science was done. So I'm interested, at least I tell them that at the turn of the 19th, 20th century, that French and German were the primary languages of science. And so I'm curious, a couple of questions of that. One, I assume when Fields went to lectures, they were in Germany, they were in German. I'm curious, were there notes in English or in German?
Mostly English, but a bit of German.
Yeah, and the lectures were, so the notebooks, like a lot of them are in German actually. So he was actually gifted in languages. So
He was.
so there's evidence of that, like during his school years. So and also I think because he was planning, I think there was training beforehand. So he not only was he gifted, but I think he was probably leaning towards research even as an undergrad. So he must have been knew that, okay, well, if I want to study more, I need to know the languages. And so he was just fortunate that he had a natural inclination for languages from an early age. So
he learned them here at a young age?
It's probably in school. Yeah, I don't know specifically.
I think languages in Ontario were taught very badly and minimally. But I think he went to Paris and he had a knack for languages and he learned French. And then he went to Germany and he learned German. For him, I think it was entirely natural. His colleagues were impressed with his linguistic ability.
That was one of my questions. When and where did he learn this stuff?
I think.
But he probably didn't write anything in French or German?
Pardon me?
He did not write anything in French or German? A paper? Right?
Did he write in French
Yeah.
and German? The only French writing I ever saw, he wrote a note in French to Mitag Leffler, who did not know English very well. So, but I never saw any other correspondence of his in any other language but English.
And just like, relevant, but in some way other than relevant. So 1924 Toronto, how much French would there have been? How many people would have
Very
known
little.
French in Toronto?
Very little.
There was a very large Italian community in Toronto, and they threw a reception in 1924 for the delegates. And someone in the newspaper commented, never had Toronto seen such a reception as thrown by the Italian community. So, but I don't know how much French there was, not a lot.
It's It's a pretty British city, even though we're.
As it happened, I brought along a book that I got when I went to the International Math Congress in 1986. Some of you may have this, but on one of the pages, there's a list of the languages used by the plenary speakers. And in 1924, there were 4 plenary speeches in English, 3 in French, and 1 in Italian. There were no plenary speeches in English in either 1897 or 1900. And the English was the only language used in plenary speeches in 1978 and 1983. So you can see the dominance of English. By way of contrast, in 1932 in Zurich, 2 speeches in English, 9 in French and 10 in German. And in 1936 in Oslo, 7 in English, 2 in French and 10 in Germany. Of course, when we go to Cambridge in the USA, we have 19 English speeches, 2 French and 1 German. So English predominates. There were speeches in Russian in 1954, 58, 62, and 66. And the number of speeches was respectively 3, 1, 3, and 5 in Moscow. So that gives you some idea of the languages, but you can see the general drift towards English. Italian, the last speech given, plenary speech given in Italian was in 1928. So
Was that by Pinkerley? Was that by Pinkerley? No,
Oh.
was the speech in 1928 in
1938.
Bologna, was that by
I could probably
Pinkerley?
find that out, but maybe I should give the microphone over and I'll look that up and I'll let you know.
When we're talking about the conditions of the Fields Medal, there is, of course, some question about the age when that actually came into play. But I believe it's not controversial that Fields himself had some idea. I mean, he didn't want the country to be listed on the medal. He didn't want any person to be, or certainly not his image to be on the medal. And even the idea of the medalist, the name of the medalist, not to be so prominently displayed. Even today, I believe it's only etched on the rim. Can you say how people reacted to that? Because on the one hand, he's trying to put Canada on the map in terms of mathematics, mathematical activity. He's inspired by what's happening in the United States and in Europe. And on the other hand, he's not giving, in his view, the recognition that he wants mathematicians to receive is not nationalistic. This is for the contributions to the discipline. Nowadays, fast forward 100 years, countries, tabulate these things. Oh, how many medals did this country win, and how many medals did that country win? So things have changed a lot, but he seems to be way, way, way ahead of his time. And I'm curious to know, how people took it at that time, and what lessons we have to learn today, in a world that has become so nationalistic, so polarized, so geopolitical. It seems to me it's a very relevant topic.
Well, insofar as Fields was trying to build Canadian mathematics, you can say that it was nationalistic. But nevertheless, he was a confirmed internationalist himself, based on his own experience and based upon his respect for mathematicians elsewhere. So are you saying that we are more nationalistic now than at that time?
Well, definitely the way the Fields Medal is viewed is a lot more nationalist. And you can add to that, but countries do tabulate, how many did each country win. And you see that in conversation. So definitely, yes, it has the way it's perceived now and treated. It has become a nationalistic award. I'm asking. Yeah, well, they still count them too. Yeah, no. Even those that haven't won it too. Yeah. Even those that haven't won it. Yeah, no, I think I won't name any names. But I'm still trying to draw attention to the fact that he seemed to be way ahead of his time in that point of view. And there's a lesson to be learned there. And it's a lesson for us today. It's a lesson for the international mathematical union. It's something to be proposed because we haven't gotten any better in terms of geopolitical tensions and divisions that are actually obstacles to advancing our discipline. People here, no, we know in the institute when we try to invite people from certain areas, you can't nowadays because of problems.
But if you look at mathematics and the entire intellectual spectrum, mathematics is probably the most international today. I think that is true. History and literature are definitely not international. And physics, I don't, probably, and medicine are international. That's my
Yeah, one
observation.
of my last questions that kind of draws back to that actually, which is that historians of mathematics have written that this period between say 1890 and 1914 that Fields lived through and was in his productive younger years was really a unique period in which the mathematical community experienced an unprecedented level of both global connection and international cooperation, with journals coming online and just increased communications and probably travel too. So this character of professional life that I suppose had been experienced as interconnected but unbroken by nationalistic tensions, fundamentally changed after 1914 and continued to deteriorate in the post-war years. So that uncomplicated kind of cooperation was gone. And so I guess that was my question, was that in working to create this medal and in the way he created it, was he trying to revive this kind of, maybe it was a naive spirit of internationalism that he experienced, but that he lived through, before the war, trying to restore that in some way?
I can't imagine what was in Fields' head. He had some money and he was ill and he needed to do something with it. And he made left small amounts of money to brother, sister, and Mrs. whatever her name was. And I just think he thought it was a good idea. I don't think he had a lot of people encouraging him to do that, although Singh did. Singh did, definitely. So
the rest, I think you could speculate. Like up at front here is the paper in Medvedev's journal, and he went. Again, Medvedev was very international, so and he was very impressed about that meeting. So I'm sure this left a shadow in his psyche, and like Medvedev, even after in the mid-war period, he would still publish things in German, whereas like other journals.
Who was Medvedev?
Yeah.
Yes, well, he didn't know English.
Yeah, but I mean, he accepted papers, right? So other journals would say, okay, we're not going to publish unless it's, we're not going to publish in German because you're part of the Allied, the not part of the Allies, right? So like they were even turning stuff away because of the language you spoke. And like even on in the First World War, right? He lived there, but he was on the boat when war broke out. So he's having dinner, nice conversations with these, German mathematicians that were going to be granted special awards in Australia. And, through no fault of their own, they, other than their nationality, they were put in jail. And
only the young ones of war age. The older ones were released and made their way back home.
Yeah, but I mean, you can think about it, think about your interactions with your colleagues and, was it their fault that war broke out? And if the most important thing, your North Star, as you put it, which I think is great, is, that research ideal. And that's what, everyone around you is working towards. Like, you can sort of speculate that, okay, and that's maybe why he didn't even want the country on the medal, because a particular individual might find themselves in a situation where, they're a country that has been censored, and by not having it there, you could sort of maybe hopefully you could get a job somewhere else where you won't be censored. So I think you could speculate that yes, you could see like little clues, but again, we can't read his mind. As far as I know, there's no documentary evidence that really outlines his thinking at great length. Yeah,
he did consider a different design for the medal. He considered the outline of the coast of North America, South America. He considered that as a possible design for the medal. And he asked people in the American Mathematical Society for their opinions, especially the historians among them, for their opinion about the designs he was considering. One of the things that hasn't been done, and I will certainly not do it, but there are archives in the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where the sculptor Tate McKenzie, the sculptor of the Fields Medal, Tate McKenzie, taught in Philadelphia. And I have looked for correspondence between them here. And I think if there is any correspondence between Fields and the sculptor of the medal, it's probably in Pennsylvania. So if someone else has an
Well,
interest.
On that note,
Go
for
for it.
future student research projects and on the hope of renewed internationalism in the world, I think we'd like to thank the speakers again for their presentations and thanking the audience